Hey everybody, it's me, Cynthia, otherwise known as Mama Mess of Complete and Utter Mess, a creative playground. And today I'm going to show you how I make eyes for my polymer clay characters. First I'm going to show you some secret weapons I have, and then I'll share a few tips and tricks with you, and then we'll go on to actually painting an eye. So let's get started. Now, one of the most important things that you need in order to paint these eyes are some very, very small brushes. My favorite is this Thompson Enamel 3/0. As you can see, it's really very, very, very fine and small. But I do also want to point out that this is what's known as a liner brush. And so the tip of the brush is pointed. There are some other small brushes, very, very small brushes, but you see that tip isn't pointed, and so it's much more difficult to work with. Another really helpful set of tools when painting these eyes are these ball tools. Now, those of us who work with polymer clay think of these as, sculpting tools, tools that help us to sculpt. But people also use them with paint, and they call them dotting tools. So I just want to show you. I'm just going to dip this ball into some paint and place it down. And as you can see, it makes a pretty symmetrical circle. And so these tools are very, very helpful for making irises and pupils and highlights. But the absolute star of the show here are these Sweet Elite eye tools. They were designed by Autumn Carpenter to use with fondant, but they work beautifully with polymer clay. The tools come in 3 different sizes: small, medium, and large. And each set has 4 different eye styles. There's almond eyes, paisley eyes, wide eyes, and gumdrops. And they're just extremely easy to use. The paisley eyes and the almond eyes are double-sided because you have a right and a left eye. The wide eye and the gumdrop eye are on one tool, and that's because you don't need a right and a left for those styles, and they're just the easiest things on earth to use. You simply take the tool and press it into wherever you've made your eye depression. So that's the paisley eye. Let me pop that down there a little bit. And so I used one end for the right eye, and now I'm going to go ahead and use the other end for the left eye. This is the wide eye, and I don't have a left and a right, and so I'm able to use the same end in order to make both eyes. So they really do make life a whole lot easier. It's just so simple to get 2 eyes that are the same shape and the same size. And I will put a link to where you can get those tools in the information section below. Okay, I have just a few more tips and tricks, and then we can move on to actually painting an eye, making an eye. So my first hint is to go as large as you can when you first start. When I first started trying to paint eyes, I was using the smallest of these cabochon molds, and that made it very, very difficult for me to learn how to do this. And so, the larger you go, the better off you are. My second tip is to go ahead and give yourself some guidelines. just take your craft knife and mark your circle or your dome, down the middle and, also horizontally. The human eyes are usually about halfway down the head, so this gives you a great guideline, so you don't wind up with one eye up here and one eye down there. My third tip is to use a tool to make the eye depressions. I tried and tried to use my thumbs or to use my index fingers or to make these depressions, and I don't know, one of my hands must be larger than the other because I just could never get two eye depressions of the same size. And my final tip, and this might seem obvious, but it took me a while to get this. Once you've made the eye depressions, you want to go ahead and shape your face, make your nose, and make your mouth before you use the eye tool to make the eyes. What happens is if you use the eye tool at this point, let's just do that right here. And then you try to make the nose and, form your temples and so on. Well, you wind up deforming the shape of the eyes. You just don't get a very nice effect at all. Okay, so that was all my secret weapons and my hints and tricks. So let's get started. Let's make an eye. Okay, I have some scrap clay here. And I've used the large wide eye tool to make an eye, and I have some white clay here that I've rolled out on the thickest setting of my pasta machine. Let's just get that out of there. Okay, I do paint most of the eye, but I use the white clay to make the white of the eye. Now, the directions that come with this say to make a ball of clay and press it into this eye depression. And I did try that, but I found that I could never get two balls of clay the same size. So I'd have, more clay in one eye than the other eye. So what I've begun doing is I take the same tool that I used to make the eye and I press it into the white clay. Then I take a craft knife and I'm sorry, let me get so everybody can see this. I take a craft knife and I carefully just cut out the eye. It doesn't have to be perfect because we're going to have to smooth it out anyways. But I get that basic shape. And I'm just going to smooth out the edges here a little bit. Just get that basic shape. And I drop that right into the depression. Just pop that right in there. So you can see I just cut that out of the white clay. And I've put it right into the socket here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use this silicone clay shaper to sort of press it in and roll it into all of the corners where I want it to be. There we go. And the reason why I use the clay for the whites of the eye is, coverage actually. When you try to do it with just paint, it takes an awful lot of coats of paint. Also, you do want there to be a little bit of volume. It looks better than if you just paint white into the depression. Now, once I've kind of got it placed where I want it, then what I do is I take a little bit of baby oil on a brush, and I get the eye as smooth as I can. Now let me just show you that there. Some baby oil. I'm going to just tap the excess off, and then I just begin brushing. Another benefit to this is if you did get, you know, any little bit of lint or anything on the whites of the eye, usually the baby oil will help you take that off. And I take my time with at this point because we are going to paint, you know, right on the uncured clay. And so the smoother it is, the better off we are. So I'm going to go ahead and finish smoothing out the white of this eye, and then when I come back, we'll begin painting. Okay, now here's the moment we've all been waiting for. And I'm just using a little piece of patty paper here as a palette. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the darker, I use two colors for the iris. I pick a darker color and a light color. And you'll see why in just a few minutes. And I'm going to just put a little bit, you don't need much. That's actually more than you need. A little bit of the darker iris color down. And I'm going to add just a drop of water to it. I don't want to thin the paint out too much, but I do want the paint to flow nicely. And so if you add just a little bit of water to that, that helps with that. It helps the paint flow much better. Okay, just pardon my arm there, but I am a real stickler about keeping my brushes nice, and so I rinse the brush off right away. Now I also want to mention that I did test these paints out on some scrap clay before I used them, and I know that they can take the heat of curing. Now what you're going to do at this point is take a look at the size of the eye you just made, and take a look at the ball tools, and you kind of test out which one would make the best size iris. And I think that's actually a little small, and so I'm going to try the larger size. I don't think that one is actually going to fit in the eye. So let's go with this one. Yeah, I think that would be pretty good. And what I do is I wipe the tool off every single time, because if I know what size it will make if I dip it in once and dot it down once. But I don't know what size it's going to make if I dip it in once, dot it down once, and then dip it in again without cleaning it off. So we're only doing one eye here today, so that's not so much of a problem. Okay. Now, if you like that, you can leave that just like that. Otherwise, you can go ahead and take one of your tiny brushes and you can enlarge that if you'd like to. I think that that's probably a pretty good size, and I just see one spot here where I would like to touch it up a little bit there. The paint wasn't totally covering that one spot. Now at this point, it's very important that you go ahead and allow this to completely dry. I know it's on uncured clay, but it will dry on the uncured clay. And then once it's dry, we will go ahead and make a highlight with the lighter color. Now I went ahead and I let my iris dry, completely dry, and now I've got a lighter color, and once again I've added a little bit of water to this just to make it flow a little bit easier. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to paint a little crescent shape. It doesn't have to be completely perfect. But you know, one of the reasons why I went with paint is if I make a mistake, I can cover it up with more paint. Just a little crescent there. Just like that. And then once again, what we have to do is we have to wait for this to completely dry. And then we'll use another dotting tool to add the pupil. And finally, we'll line the eye. All right, I've let the iris and the highlight dry. And I've got some black paint that I've thinned out. And I'm going to go ahead. I think this is probably a good one. That looks like that's a pretty good size for a pupil for me. I'll go ahead and just dip that in there. And I'm going to go on top of, you know, I don't want to cover up too much of this highlight or too much of the eye. Oh, that's going to drip. So let's. So I'm going to go right on top of where I made that that highlight. There we go. That looks pretty good to me. Now I have another eye here, and I actually, you know, covered up a little too much of the highlight, more of the highlight than I wanted to with my pupil. But again, that's the great thing about the paint is once that pupil dries, I can put the highlight back in. All right, now once I've got the pupil in, I usually just go ahead and line the eye. I don't wait for the pupil to dry. Just hold on just one moment here. Now I'm using a very small brush, and I'm being sure to only get the paint on the tip of the brush. I'm not getting a great big huge blob of paint on there, and I sometimes will just test it out. just put it down a few times, almost like a little practice run. Remember, you can always add paint. You can't necessarily take paint away. Now for the bottom of the eye, I usually just line where the iris is. That's just a little style I've developed. So I'm going to start here and then just go straight across to where the iris ends. And if you think that line is too thin, you can add a little. I'd rather be too thin than be too thick. Although if you do go too thick, then, you know, again, you're using paint. So you could come back in with white paint or blue paint and fix that line up if you wanted to. That's my whole reason for going with paint and not clay. I do see people out there that make, you know, beautiful eyes using clay, but this is the method that's worked better for me. And so just right there. Now probably what I'll do when the whole eye is dry is add just a little tiny bit more blue down the bottom here, because there is a little bit of the whites showing. Again, that's paint is kind of versatile. And for the top of the eye, I usually will start at the inner corner and go to the outer corner. just take my time and do a little bit at a time. And again, I just keep in mind that I can always add paint. It's not as easy to take paint away or cover up too much paint. Up here at the top of the eye, I try to go a little bit thicker. And one of the nice things about working on a flat face like this, you know, if you're making a pendant or a magnet, is that you can move the whole eye rather than trying to move the whole brush. But if you're working, you know, on a head for a figurine, then, you know, that can get, you know, you can't really turn the head. You have to just practice. And, you know, I'm not sure if you can actually teach this so much as you can just show what you do and then advise people to practice on scrap clay. And you know, I guess I am holding very, very close to the brush tip, because that helps me to have some control. And down here at the bottom corner of the eye is where I make the line the thickest. Add a little there. And a lot of people add a little flick like that. And for the eyelashes, if you're trying to represent eyelashes, eyelashes are shortest at the corners of the eye, and they're longest at the top of the eye. And so I'm going to start right down here at the corner. Just make one little lash. I make the next lash a little bit longer. And then the final lash I'll make a little bit longer than that. So there we go. We have a somewhat disembodied eye. I'm going to go ahead and let this all dry a little bit, and then when I come back I'll put in the highlights. Okay, so now, you know, we made the whites of the eye, we made the iris, we made the pupil, and now what I'm going to do is add some highlights to the pupil. So the best way to do that I have found is to take a very small ball tool. That's what I have here. I'm going to go ahead and dip it into some white paint, and again I've added a little bit of water to that paint. And then usually what I do is I choose the outer corner of upper outer corner, I guess, of the eye. And again, we'll wipe that off. And then the inner lower corner of the eye. And there you go. And that's how I make eyes. This was a lot of fun. I hope you found it helpful. If you enjoyed this video, you can support us by hitting like and subscribe. And please follow us on Facebook and visit us on www.completeanduttermess.com. Thanks for watching.